Well, hello and welcome to an end of year edition of Adam's Music Box. For those who are wondering, I don't do stuff during Christmas. I do Christmas stuff during Christmas. And unfortunately, for the people that watch this channel, or maybe fortunately for the people who don't, that doesn't include streaming. But I'm back. And I guess starting from either tomorrow or the day after, I don't want to make any commitments, but sooner or later, I'll be back to my normal daily routine and weekend streams. But since it's a weird week, we're going to do an unusual stream. And this stream is a paying of tribute to all of the great artists that we lost in 2024. Of course, there's not enough time to mention all of them, but I'm going to try to get through as many as possible, particularly the ones that I've enjoyed over my lifetime and that hold a special place in my heart. Now, another disclaimer before we get to the good stuff. Time is an artificial construct, and it's a fairly stupid one at that. It's a bit like what George Carlin said: the world isn't going anywhere. We are. And with that in mind, here are some of the artists that went in 2024. I just made a list of a few that I quite like, and here we go. Well, the first one is someone who's not necessarily a household name to music listeners, but he's definitely a household name to musicians and people in the music industry, and that's Bob Heil. Now, Bob Heil, who died earlier this year, was a true Renaissance man. He was one of the pioneers of the modern public address system, and the name public address really doesn't do him justice, because before Bob Heil, the public address system was just that, loud but relatively low fidelity speakers that could be used for someone to make an address, a speech. Please move to the back of the hall. Would the person with the blue cabriolet please turn their lights? All of that good stuff. But Bob Heil was able to turn the PA system into something that was increasingly high fidelity. By the 70s, it was surround sound, quadraphonic. It was loud enough to fill large auditoriums, large stadiums, and it was sophisticated enough where you could get a clean live mix and hear the separation of the instruments, hear the vocals with clarity, all things that weren't available before Bob. And these were, of course, some of the things that made the Beatles stop touring. But he was also an organist. He was a professional organist. He played on one of the great mighty Wurlitzers that are now increasingly rare, but one of my favorite instruments of all time. He invented the talk box, which so many artists ended up using. People like Peter Frampton, people like Joe Walsh. Later variants were used by Zapp, Roger Troutman, very successfully. He worked with the Grateful Dead, with The Who. He was a well known ham radio operator. He worked with multiple radio stations across the world. Really an interesting guy. And he unfortunately left us this year at the age of 83. Let's see what else we have on this list. Toby Keith, we lost this year, one of the most popular country and Western artists of the last sort of 20 to 25 years. He's someone who was very good at writing a memorable song, memorable hooks, very memorable lyrics. And he was someone who was never a favorite of the critics, but he was someone that people loved because he wrote party music. He wrote music to make you feel better. He wrote music to get you pumping your fist. It was music for everyone. And it was music that so many millions of people could relate to. Sammy Hagar, who I'm a big fan of course, was a good friend of his. He paid tribute to him this year. Just an all around great guy. He was 62, bit young, but life can be like that. Mary Weiss from the Shangri-Las, who weren't produced by Phil Spector, but you could have been forgiven for thinking that they were. They did the song Leader of the Pack, which sounds very tame by today's standards, but it was quite a rebellious song by the standards of 1964 in that sort of wall of sound style. Frank Farian, the producer, we lost this year, a controversial person who worked with many great musicians and many fake musicians. To start with the real ones, he produced for Meatloaf. He produced a project called the Far Corporation, which featured the great drummer Simon Phillips, Bobby Kimball, David Page, Steve Lukather. That's about half of Toto right there. They did a cover of Stairway to Heaven in '85. It's one song you're not supposed to cover, but when you've got half of Toto with you, they do a very good job indeed. But he's perhaps more famous for producing some fake bands. There was Boney M, which were essentially a stage act that danced around to sort of lip sunk disco style music. And more famously, his most sort of beloved and notorious fake band was, of course, Milli Vanilli. There was a documentary about them this year. And Fab Morvan, actually, one of the duo, there was Rob and there was Fab. Rob sadly died in the '90s. Some say suicide. We don't really know. But Fab actually is a really feel good story because he never let the whole chaos get him down. He actually took singing lessons and he's out there not only in the fashion world, but he sings. He's out there singing with his real voice, including some of the Milli Vanilli songs that were good songs that Frank Farian produced very, very well. So maybe not the most ethical guy, but he's definitely Frank Farian, someone who left a mark on the music industry. Now, I'm a Frank Zappa fan, a huge Frank Zappa fan, as many of you who listen to this channel regularly know. And we lost Tom Fowler, who came from a wonderful musical family. There was Walt, there was Bruce, just so many great musicians. Tom was one of Zappa's bassists throughout the 1970s, playing on many albums, many live dates, and just one hell of a musician. You have to be to play for Frank Zappa. And we unfortunately lost him this year. We lost Marlena Shaw, a very good, I would say, underrated soul singer. She did a string of really excellent albums in the '70s. 1969's The Spice of Life was one of her first, but it's also one of the ones that is most beloved because it has a song that wasn't a massive hit, but which later became a kind of underground hit because it was sampled so much by many hip hop artists. And this song was California Soul, which became a sort of signature song for Marlena Shaw. And we also lost Martin Mull, another person who you could call a Renaissance man. He did acting, he did comedy. He was trained as an engineer, a very interesting performer and songwriter, beloved by so many on both the stage and screen. He died this year at the age of 80. Kinky Friedman, a great sort of parody artist. He sort of was the spoof on cowboy culture. He was on the Adam Carolla show a lot, which I love. It's a great show. He ran as an independent candidate as governor for Texas. Serious or not, you be the judge. I don't know. Was that before or after Arnold Schwarzenegger? I think it was around the same time as he was doing his thing in California. And we lost another great musician associated with Frank Zappa, Ed Mann, one of the great vibraphonists, marimbists, and xylophonists of all time. If it was pitched mallet percussion, and frankly any other kind of percussion, Ed Mann could play it, and he could play it better than just about anyone else in the business. He played with Zappa on so many great albums in both the '70s and the '80s. I would say during Zappa's artistic peak, just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful stuff. And we lost him at the age of only 69, which isn't, that used to be considered old, but it isn't anymore. At least so we are told. We lost Randy Fuller, who was part of the Bobby Fuller Four. Bobby Fuller Four. Say that three times fast. They did the most well-known version of "I Fought the Law," and the law won, unless you run a crypto scam, but not if you're Diddy. Make it make sense. You know, send your hate mail somewhere else. Okay, moving on. Doug Ingle, who was the organist and lead vocalist of none other than Iron Butterfly in A Gotta Davida Baby. He had a very interesting life, and they produced a lot of great albums. So very influential. He left the music business after Iron Butterfly sort of tapered off, and he lived in an RV for a while and at the LA National Forest. In true hippie style, but he had a long life, 78 years old, and he was the last member of the band Iron Butterfly to die. So Iron Butterfly is no more, but the music, of course, lives on, and I did a video about him. John Barbata, a wonderful session drummer, played on so many hits by the Turtles. Listen to Imagine Me and You, Happy Together. I think that's what it's called. So Happy Together, you know, that the Turtles song, the Turtles were great. He played drums on a lot of their albums. He played for Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. He was even briefly, well, not that briefly, in Jefferson Starship, a really good, solid session drummer who did some pretty famous tours as well. And we lost him this year. And we also lost Calvin Keys, a wonderful jazz guitarist who played on Black Records. Now, I did a video earlier this year on Black Records. It was an independent jazz label that really focused on musically conscious records in the avant garde and soul jazz genres. It was formed in the Oakland area in the 70s, and some of the best albums on that label were put out by Calvin Keys. He played both as leader on various albums and as sideman. He also played with one of my favorite pianists of all time on several albums. That would be Ahmad Jamal. So another great one. Now, one of my absolute favorite R&B singers of all time. You might not know the name, but you will have heard some of his songs. And this is none other than Clarence Frogman Henry. I would say that his most well-known song is from 56 and I Ain't Got a Home. And he sings it in his normal voice and then he sings it in a frog voice. Some of you who weren't around in 1956 might remember that when Rush Limbaugh would talk about homeless stories, that seems quaint based on what's going on today, he would play that song. And he also did a wonderful ballad a few years later, I Don't Know Why I Love You, But I Do. Wonderful, wonderful singer. Again, he should be a household name because I really like him, and what I say goes until they censor me. Um, Jerry Conway, a musician who played in Jethro Tull in the 80s, yep, after their sort of peak, but nevertheless, he was part of the band and he played for Fairport Convention. And he performed probably most famously in the 1970s in the touring band that backed Cat Stevens when he was at his absolute peak. So, another important figure that we've lost, Steve Harley of Cockney Rebel. They were very, you could say that they were underground, you could say that they were popular, they were both. They managed to sort of straddle both of those things, and we lost him this year. Eric Carmen, he came to prominence in the Raspberries, Please Go All the Way. Everyone knows that one. And then as a solo artist, he had mega hits, including one that he co-wrote with Rachmaninoff, although Rachmaninoff wasn't around to know it, All by Myself. Everyone loves it. Never Gonna Fall in Love Again. Great one. Hungry Eyes. I'll stop singing once you tip me. But no, he was really, really a wonderful all-round musician, great songwriter, and he died at the age of 74 this year. Probably the most well-known musician we lost this year was Quincy Jones. Now, I did a relatively long video on Quincy. I've actually done standalone videos on many of the figures that we lost this year. He was 91, and he played with everyone as an arranger, as a composer, as a performer, as a producer, from Frank Sinatra to Elvis Presley to, of course, Michael Jackson. I mean, there's a shorter list of people that Quincy Jones didn't play with and didn't arrange and compose for. Um, you can watch my video on Quincy Jones because such a long life in music can't really be easily summarized, but we've all been touched by his music at one time or another. One of the founding members of the Grateful Dead, Phil Lesh, died. He was 84. He was best known as the bassist for the band and played in several sort of spin-off bands after the Grateful Dead sort of finished their thing. He opened up a music venue called Terrapin Crossroads in Northern California, which was sort of a place where he and other members of the Dead used to play. So sadly, another member of that musical family with us no more. Chris Christopherson, one of the finest songwriters of all time and such a compelling performer. He was someone that sort of was in an era where the term crossover wasn't really a thing the way it sort of became in the 90s. But he was someone with a foot in the country world, in the pop world, in the rock world in some ways, just an all around beloved songwriter and performer with so many hits. And you could really feel the impact because so many people were deeply moved when he died to remember the good times they had to the soundtrack of their lives that he in part wrote. He was 88. Moving on the list, Catherine Crosby at the age of 90. She was the widow of Bing Crosby, one of my very favorite performers of all time, and something of a musician and actress in her own right. She was performing as recently as sort of 2014, 2015, and she died just this year. Tito Jackson, of course, very sad. Of course, a member of the Jackson Five, and someone who we all sort of grew up with. Well, at least a lot of people who are watching this channel. He was 70 years old. Of course, he outlived his brother Michael. Very a family that brought people so much happiness, but internally they suffered some unfortunate things, and a lot of people were sorry to see him go. We lost Zoot Money at the age of 82. He was in all sorts of rock bands. Whenever the US rock stars of the 50s and early 60s would come to the UK and London in particular, he would back them with his band. He worked with Eric Burdon, Steve Marriott, Peter Green, of course, Alexis Corner, Humble Pie. The list goes on. Really, really a polymath, really talented musician there. Frankie Beverly, we did on this channel a video all about him. One of the very most talented songwriters, singers, pianists of all time. He was best known for fronting the band Maze, and he had such a unique brand of soul and funk R&B music that really transitioned seamlessly from the 70s to the 80s. Such a nice person too. I've met people that have worked with him as a musician, only wonderful things to say about Frankie Beverly, who was around so many bands and so many musicians, Maze being the music that was really his own, that he put his mark on, because that was his band. Sergio Mendes, one of the musicians who really brought Brazilian flavored themes to the international pop charts. The Brazil 66 was something that Herb Alpert got behind on A&M Records, and they took the world absolutely by storm. So many great albums over such a long period of time. Um, in 1983, he sort of had a career revival because he had a self-titled album, and on that album, he covers a song written by Cynthia Weil and Barry Mann, which is "Never Going to Let You Go." And this was the song that Rick Beato made. He made it famous again because it was a much beloved song in the early 80s. But Rick Beato made it famous again by calling it the most musically complex pop song ever. And he did a whole breakdown of why that is. And that was, of course, an arrangement by none other than Sergio Mendes. Greg Kinn of the Greg Kinn Band, Our Love's in Jeopardy. That was a big one. And They Don't Write Them Like That Anymore, which was really, really a good song. Underrated, if you ask me. Just an excellent song. Jerry Miller of Moby Grape died this year at the age of 81. They were really big in that San Francisco psychedelic scene. You might remember Mr. Van Driesen from Beavis and Butthead had Moby Grape 8 tracks, if that gives you some idea of what we're looking at. Please Come to Boston, another one of those absolute classic songs. Dave Loggins, who died this year, kind of shocked me because he seemed like one of those laid back singer songwriters who was going to be around forever. But we lost him at the age of 76. We're getting to the end here. Now, of course, there are many others that we could put on this list, but I'm trying not to have a 6-hour video. Now, Zakir Hussain was someone who was widely known in the world of Indian classical music. He was a great tabla player. He was someone who was a great inspiration to a lot of people, not only in South Asian music, but also to people in a lot of Western music. He was part of the band Shakti, which was a sort of Western style guitar jazz fusion and classical Indian raga music fusion band. This was called Shakti, and this was, of course, fronted by John McLaughlin and Zakir Hussain. And McLaughlin obviously were partners in it. They were co-equals, and they did some really interesting stuff together. This was an era of sort of where Ravi Shankar was doing his ragas on the Johnny Carson show and all that. But Shakti took it to very different places and a lot of interesting improvisation. Now, Roy Haynes is without doubt, in anyone's mind, one of the very finest jazz drummers of all time. He has played with everyone. And in particular, in sort of the last 15 or so years of his life, he did so much work with Chick Corea, which is frankly some of, if you had to narrow down some of his best work, it could well be considered some of his best. He was the kind of musician that was ageless. So wonderful. He kept musicians on their toes because he played around the beat while still maintaining a pulse. Really hard to do. Again, a great sense of melody. And finally, the wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death, the sunlight brightly gleams. Where every man is torn apart with nightmares and with dreams. Will no one lay the laurel wreath when silence drowns the screams? That's a far cry from "She Loves You." Yeah, yeah, yeah. But those were lyrics written by Peter Sinfield on the album that introduced him and his unique brand of lyrics to the world, In the Court of the Crimson King. He would go on to do lyrics for so many other bands, other King Crimson albums, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. He did an album of his own. He then did pop music lyrics in the 80s, which shows you just how versatile he is. And we lost him at the age of 80. And I suppose that because time is artificial, there's nothing better to bring it to life than that great art that reminds us that, in the words of Picasso, all art is a lie, which helps us to better understand the truth. So we end with the poet, and that is my particular list of the artists we lost this year that touched me, and I know that touched many. Regular service will resume in a few days for those who like this channel, and for those who don't like this channel, beware. As always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.